Chapter 15. Justice and Madness. April in Vermont meant mud season, that transitional period when winter's grip finally loosened and spring struggled to assert itself. The roads were a mess, the trees still bare, but there was warmth in the air that promised better days ahead. Connor McMasters found the metaphor almost too obvious as he drove to the county courthouse for Ian Martin's competency hearing. 6 months had passed since that night in the woods. 6 months of police investigations, psychiatric evaluations, media frenzy, and careful management of 9 resurrection survivors. 6 months of Connor maintaining the fiction that he was simply a skilled doctor with remarkable luck, not a 400-year-old necromancer who'd treated serial killing like a game until it stopped being entertaining. The parking lot was packed. Connor found a spot at the far edge and walked toward the courthouse, his medical bag over one shoulder. A prop, really, but one that reinforced his professional identity. Regional journalists had descended on Millbrook for this hearing, drawn by the sensational story. A serial killer who claimed his victims had been resurrected by a necromancer. Inside, the courthouse hummed with anticipation. Connor slipped into the courtroom and found a seat in the middle of the gallery, neither too prominent nor too hidden. Around him sat curious townspeople. Some he recognized from the grocery store or the diner, others strangers drawn by morbid fascination. 3 rows behind him, he spotted all 7 survivors seated together. Eleanor Henderson, looking composed and professional, in a navy suit. Thomas Grayson, fidgeting nervously with his wedding ring. David Ortiz and Margaret Chen sitting side by side. Jennifer Wu, quietly observing everything with her analytical gaze. Rebecca Walsh, with her hands folded in prayer. Harold Pemberton, his presence a unified statement that he'd survived and was moving forward. At the defence table, Ian Martin sat between his court-appointed attorney and a psychiatric nurse. Connor studied him dispassionately. 6 months on antipsychotics had rendered Ian gaunt, hollow-eyed, mechanically compliant. He looked like a man going through the motions of existence without actually living. His hands were cuffed to a chain around his waist, a reminder that mental illness didn't negate danger. All rise for the Honourable Judge Patricia Morrison. Everyone stood. Judge Morrison entered, a woman in her late 50s with steel grey hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that had seen too many cases where there were no good outcomes, only varying degrees of bad. She settled into her seat, reviewed the papers before her, and called the court to order. Be seated. We're here for the competency hearing of Ian Martin, charged with 7 counts of attempted murder. Mr. Roberts, your client waives his right to a jury for this hearing. The public defender, a tired-looking man in a suit that had seen better days, stood. Yes, Your Honour, Mr. Martin understands this is a bench hearing to determine his competency to stand trial. Very well. Ms. Davidson, call your first witness. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 40s with an air of controlled intensity, stood. The state calls Dr. Susan Mitchell. A middle-aged psychiatrist with sensible shoes and an efficient manner took the stand. Connor had met Dr. Mitchell twice during the investigation. Once when she'd interviewed him about Ian's delusions, and once at a coordination meeting about the survivor's mental health needs. She was competent, thorough, and blessedly skeptical of anything supernatural. After establishing her credentials, medical degree from Yale, 15 years in forensic psychiatry, extensive experience evaluating defendants, Davidson got to the heart of the matter. Dr. Mitchell, you've been evaluating Mr. Martin for the past 6 months. Can you describe his mental state? Dr. Mitchell consulted her notes, though Connor suspected she could recite them from memory. Mr. Martin exhibits persistent delusional disorder with paranoid features. He maintains an unshakable belief that his 7 victims were resurrected through supernatural means by Dr. Connor McMasters. Despite overwhelming evidence that his victims survived through medical intervention, Mr. Martin insists on an explanation rooted in magic and necromancy. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Connor kept his expression neutral, slightly bemused, the look of a rational man confronted with absurd accusations. Has medication helped? Davidson asked. The antipsychotics have reduced his agitation and helped him sleep, but they haven't touched the core delusion. Mr. Martin is no longer actively psychotic in the sense of hallucinations or disorganized thinking. He's quite lucid and articulate when discussing his beliefs. The problem is that those beliefs are fundamentally divorced from reality. In your professional opinion, Does Mr. Martin understand the nature of his crimes? Dr. Mitchell hesitated, the kind of pause that signaled complex territory. He understands he killed, or attempted to kill, 7 people. He accurately describes his methods and motives. However, his interpretation of the outcomes is where reality fractures. He cannot accept that his murders failed through circumstance, medical intervention, and his own imperfect execution. Instead, he's constructed an elaborate delusion to explain his failures. Is he competent to stand trial? Dr. Mitchell took a breath. This was the question that mattered, the one she'd been building toward. Mr. Martin understands the legal process. He knows right from wrong in an abstract sense. He can assist his attorney in recounting facts, but his grasp on reality is so compromised that I cannot say he's truly competent to participate in his own defense. His delusions would undermine any rational legal strategy. Any attempt to mount a defense would devolve into arguments about magic and resurrection, arguments that have no basis in reality and would make him appear more deranged than he actually is. Davidson nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Roberts stood for cross-examination. He looked like he was carrying the weight of impossible cases on his shoulders. Dr. Mitchell, is there any possibility Mr. Martin could recover competency with continued treatment? Possible, but unlikely. Delusional disorders, particularly when the delusions are this fixed and systematically integrated, are extraordinarily resistant to treatment. He's not hearing voices telling him these things. He's not experiencing hallucinations. He simply believes something impossible with complete conviction. That's much harder to treat than more florid psychosis. So he could spend the rest of his life incompetent? Yes. Or he could suddenly respond to treatment next year. Psychiatry isn't an exact science, Mr. Roberts. I can only tell you what's most probable based on current evidence. Roberts sat down, looking defeated. He knew what was coming. Indefinite commitment, annual reviews that would likely show no improvement, Ian Martin trapped in limbo forever. After a short recess, the court reconvened. Davidson stood. The state calls Dr. Connor McMasters. Connor felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom as he walked to the witness stand. This was theatre now, performance art designed to reinforce the narrative that he was simply a competent rural doctor, not an immortal being who'd manipulated a serial killer for entertainment. He was sworn in, took his seat, and met Davidson's eyes calmly. Dr. McMasters, please state your credentials for the court. Connor recited the carefully constructed history he'd established when he arrived in Millbrook 15 years ago. Medical degree from Johns Hopkins in 2000. Residency in emergency medicine. Extensive rural practice experience. 15 years serving Millbrook and the surrounding communities. All of it backed by forged documents and planted records. The infrastructure of a false identity maintained with 4 centuries of practice. You treated all 7 of Mr. Martin's victims. Is that correct? Yes. Can you explain how they survived what Mr. Martin describes as successful murders? Connor had rehearsed this answer until it was smooth as glass. Each case was unique, but the common factor was premature death determination. In several cases, Rebecca Walsh's fall incident, Jennifer Wu's car accident, the victims appeared dead due to shock, hypothermia, or unconsciousness. But actual brain death had not occurred. The line between clinical death and irreversible death is not always clear, especially in rural settings with limited immediate diagnostic capabilities. In other cases, my immediate intervention with CPR, emergency medications, or rapid treatment reversed what would have been fatal outcomes without that intervention. Mr. Martin insists you used supernatural means to resurrect his victims. How do you respond to that accusation? Connor allowed himself a slight smile, not mocking, but the patient indulgence of a rational person addressing an absurd claim. I'm a doctor, not a wizard. I practice evidence-based medicine. Resurrection isn't scientifically possible. What is possible is good emergency medicine, quick intervention, and occasionally remarkable luck. I've been fortunate to be in the right place at the right time to help these patients. 7 times? Davidson pressed, her tone suggesting appropriate skepticism. Connor had anticipated this. I've been practicing medicine for almost 25 years. I've saved hundreds of patients in that time, maybe thousands. These 7 were certainly unusual in their clustering over a short period, but individually, each survival is medically explainable. Sometimes coincidences happen. It doesn't make them supernatural. Davidson nodded, satisfied. No further questions. Roberts stood for cross-examination, and Connor braced himself. The defence attorney had a difficult job, trying to argue Ian was delusional without proving the delusions false, since proving them false would undermine the incompetency claim. Dr. McMasters, isn't it true that multiple coroners initially declared several of these patients dead? That death certificates were actually issued? Yes, Connor acknowledged. Mistakes happen, especially in rural areas with limited resources. Death determination can be complicated in cases of extreme hypothermia, severe shock, or certain types of poisoning. I've seen misdiagnoses before. These 7 were simply compressed into a short time frame. Convenient. Accurate, Connor corrected, his tone professional but firm. You can examine my medical records. I've documented every intervention, every treatment decision, every medication administered. Everything is medically sound and follows standard emergency protocols. If you find anything that suggests supernatural intervention rather than medicine, I'd be interested to see it. Roberts consulted his notes. Isn't it true that Mr. Martin believes you're 400 years old? Judge Morrison's voice cut in before Connor could answer. Counsel, are you seriously planning to litigate claims of magic and immortality in my courtroom? No, Your Honour, Roberts said quickly. Just establishing the nature and extent of Mr. Martin's delusions. Then establish it without wasting the court's time on fantasy. Morrison's tone was sharp. Move on. Roberts tried a different angle. Dr. McMasters, how do you explain being present for so many of these incidents? The statistical probability? I live in a small town, and I'm the primary emergency physician. Connor interrupted smoothly. When something happens, I'm called. When someone's dying, I respond. That's not statistics. That's my job. Roberts looked frustrated, but pressed on. Mr. Martin claims you manipulated him, that you knew about his crimes and allowed them to continue so you could resurrect his victims. Is there any truth to that? Connor felt the courtroom's attention sharpen. This was dangerous territory, not because anyone would believe it, but because partial truths could spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. No, Connor said flatly. I had no knowledge of Mr. Martin's crimes until after I'd treated his victims. I didn't know there was a pattern until Chief Rodriguez made the connection between the cases. The idea that I somehow knew what Mr. Martin was doing and allowed it to continue is both absurd and offensive. I'm a doctor. I save lives when I can. I don't orchestrate murder sprees. It was a lie wrapped in truth, delivered with perfect conviction. Connor had 4 centuries of practice lying to authority figures, and he'd never been better at it than now. Roberts seemed to deflate. No further questions. The witness may step down, Judge Morrison said. Connor returned to his seat in the gallery, feeling the weight of Ian's stare on his back. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge it. Let Ian stare. Let him rage silently. There was nothing he could do about it. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses, Chief Rodriguez, who testified about the investigation, and a medical expert who explained how each survival was medically plausible. Then the defence called Ian's family, his sister, who tearfully described his mental deterioration, his bizarre obsessions, his descent into paranoid delusions. When the testimony concluded, Judge Morrison called for final arguments. Davidson argued that Ian, while clearly mentally ill, was malingering or exaggerating his delusions to avoid full responsibility. She pointed to his ability to plan and execute elaborate murders, his understanding of right and wrong, his efforts to evade detection, all evidence of a functioning mind capable of standing trial. Roberts argued the opposite, that Ian's break with reality was genuine, complete, and possibly permanent, that forcing a delusional man to stand trial would be a miscarriage of justice, reducing the proceedings to absurdist theatre, where the defendant argued about necromancers while the prosecution tried to litigate murder. Your Honour, Roberts concluded, Mr. Martin needs treatment, not punishment. He's a danger to others, yes, but he's also profoundly ill. Secure psychiatric commitment serves both public safety and his interests better than a trial he cannot meaningfully participate in. Judge Morrison took less than an hour to deliberate. When she returned, Connor saw the decision in her face. This was one of those cases with no winners, only different types of losing. Mr. Martin, please stand. Ian rose unsteadily, his movements mechanical. The psychiatric nurse stood with him, ready to catch him if he fell. I have reviewed all the testimony and evidence, Morrison began. I find that while you understand the basic nature of the charges against you and the legal process, your persistent and fixed delusions render you unable to meaningfully participate in your own defence. Therefore, I find you not competent to stand trial at this time due to mental illness." Roberts looked cautiously relieved. Davidson's expression was carefully neutral. This was the outcome she'd expected, if not the one she'd wanted. "However," Morrison continued, "I also find that you pose a significant danger to yourself and others. Therefore, I am committing you to Riverside Psychiatric Facility indefinitely, with annual competency reviews. You will receive treatment. If you regain competency, you will be returned to this court to face trial for 7 counts of attempted murder. If you do not regain competency, you will remain in secure psychiatric care for the protection of the public." It was the worst of both worlds. Institutionalized without the finality of a trial, guilt assumed but not legally determined, trapped in limbo that could last decades. Ian was shaking, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists, though the chains limited his movement. Then he spoke, his voice clear and steady despite the tremor in his body. "I know how this sounds. I know no one believes me. But Connor McMasters is a necromancer. He brought 7 people back from death. I watched them die every time. He manipulated me, used my crimes as entertainment, and when I realized what he was doing, when I broke and couldn't keep playing his game, he used that to destroy me. Everything I'm saying is true." The courtroom was silent. Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly, not with belief, but with something like pity. "Mr. Martin, I genuinely hope you find peace through treatment. The fact that you believe these things so completely is precisely why you need help. These delusions may feel real to you, but they're not. Magic doesn't exist. Resurrection doesn't exist. Dr. McMasters is a doctor who saved 7 people through medicine, not supernatural means. I hope someday you can accept that." "I killed them," Ian said, his voice rising. "I watched them die. Thomas Grayson's neck cracked when I strangled him. I heard it. Jennifer Wu wasn't breathing when I left her in that car. Eleanor Henderson was cold when I walked away from her house. They were dead. They were dead, and he brought them back, and now everyone thinks I'm insane because the truth is impossible." "Sheriff Rodriguez," Morrison said quietly, "please escort Mr. Martin back to Riverside." 2 deputies moved toward Ian. He didn't resist, but as they took his arms, he turned and looked at the gallery, specifically at the row where Connor sat with the 7 survivors. "You're all dead," Ian screamed, his carefully medicated composure shattering. "I killed you, every one of you. You died. This isn't real. You're not real." The courtroom erupted. Several people gasped. One journalist was typing frantically on her laptop. Judge Morrison banged her gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" But Ian wasn't done. As the deputies pulled him toward the door, he kept shouting, his voice breaking, "Connor McMasters is a necromancer. He resurrects the dead. I'm not crazy. I'm the only one telling the truth. I'm not crazy." The doors closed behind him, muffling his screams. The courtroom slowly settled into stunned silence. Judge Morrison looked tired. "This court is adjourned. I hope Mr. Martin finds the help he needs." Connor remained seated as people filed out, their conversations a buzz of shock and discomfort. Around him, the 9 survivors sat quietly, waiting for the attention to dissipate before they left. Finally, after most of the gallery had cleared, they stood as a group and filed out together. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them immediately. Connor hung back, letting the survivors handle it. They'd planned this, rehearsed their responses. Eleanor Henderson stepped forward with practiced authority, her years as a teacher serving her well. The reporters focused on her, cameras clicking, phones recording. "Today, we're grateful that our attacker will receive the treatment he needs while being kept away from the public," Eleanor said, her voice steady and compassionate. "We hope Mr. Martin finds peace. As for us, we're moving forward with our lives, grateful for our second chances and ready to let justice take its course. We won't be giving individual interviews. We'd like to return to our private lives now. Thank you." It was perfect. Gracious toward Ian, grateful for survival, carefully avoiding any details that might invite further questions. The reporters pressed for more, but the survivors moved as a unit toward the parking lot, politely deflecting all follow-up questions. Connor waited until they'd cleared the press gauntlet before walking to his truck. He'd almost made it when a journalist intercepted him, a young woman with sharp eyes and a recorder. "Dr. McMasters, do you have any comment on Mr. Martin's accusations?" Connor paused, considering. He could refuse to comment, but that might look defensive. Better to address it head-on with the same calm rationality he'd shown in court. "I feel sorry for Mr. Martin," Connor said. "He's clearly suffering from severe mental illness. I hope he gets the treatment he needs. As for his accusations about me, they're the product of delusion, nothing more. I'm a doctor. I practice medicine. I save those people because that's my job and my calling. There's nothing supernatural about it. 7 people in 6 months. I've saved far more than 7 people in my career," Connor interrupted gently. These cases were unusual in their clustering, but individually, each was medically explainable. Sometimes timing and luck align in remarkable ways. That doesn't make it magic. He smiled. Warm, professional, slightly self-deprecating. "I'm not a wizard. I'm just a rural doctor who's been doing this long enough to be good at it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have afternoon patients to see." He walked away before she could ask more questions, got in his truck, and drove back toward Millbrook. But instead of heading to the office, he found himself driving to David Ortiz's restaurant, not yet open for dinner service, but where he knew the survivors had agreed to meet. Connor parked and went to the back door. David let him in, looking tired but relieved. "It's over," David said. "Finally over." "Is it?" Connor asked. Inside, the other 6 survivors were gathered around the bar. Rebecca was pouring wine. Afternoon drinking wasn't their norm, but today qualified as exceptional circumstances. They looked up as Connor entered, and he saw relief mixed with residual tension in their faces. "To being alive," Thomas said, raising his glass, "and to staying that way." They drank to that. Connor accepted a glass from Rebecca and stood slightly apart, feeling both connected to this group and fundamentally separate from them. They died and been brought back. He died and stayed back. They were mortal. He wasn't. The gap was unbridgeable, but that didn't make the connection less real. "Do you think he'll ever recover?" Margaret asked quietly. "Ian? I mean?" Connor considered the question seriously. "Maybe. Psychiatric conditions can surprise you, but fixed delusions like his, when someone believes something impossible with complete conviction, those are among the hardest to treat. He might spend the rest of his life in Riverside, having the same argument with doctors who'll never believe him." "Because he's right," Jennifer said. She wasn't asking. She was stating fact. "Because he's right," Connor confirmed. "And that's the cruelty of it. He's trapped by the truth. If he accepted the lie that you all survived through medicine and luck, he'd be considered sane and face murder charges. But he can't accept the lie because he knows what actually happened. So he's stuck." "I almost feel sorry for him," Eleanor said, then shook her head. "Almost. But then I remember he tried to kill 7 people, and my sympathy has limits." "Mine too," Thomas agreed. "Mental illness doesn't excuse attempted murder. He made choices. He's facing consequences." They talked for a while longer, processing, debriefing, trying to make sense of a situation that defied rational analysis. Eventually, people started leaving. The group dispersed until only Connor, Jennifer, and David remained. "What happens next?" David asked, clearing away wine glasses. "For you, I mean." Connor leaned against the bar. "I keep practicing medicine. I keep living in Millbrook. I try not to resurrect anyone else for a while." "How long is a while?" Jennifer asked. 10 years minimum, Connor said. "Maybe longer. Ian's accusations put a spotlight on my pattern of saves. I need to be more ordinary for a while. Let people forget about the miracle doctor who saved 7 murder victims." "Can you do that?" David asked. "Just let people die when you could save them?" It was the question Connor had been avoiding. Could he go back to selective intervention after 6 months of saving everyone? Could he watch someone die and walk away, knowing he could bring them back, but choosing not to? "I'll have to," Connor said quietly. "Or I'll have to leave Millbrook. Those are the options." Jennifer was watching him closely. "You don't want to leave?" "No," Connor admitted. "I don't. For the first time in a very long time, I want to stay." He left before the emotion in his voice could become too obvious, driving back to his farmhouse as afternoon faded toward evening. The house was quiet, empty, exactly as he'd left it that morning. Connor poured himself whiskey and sat on the back porch, watching the Vermont landscape settle into twilight. 400 years. 400 years of moving before anyone got too close, before questions became dangerous, before connection turned into liability. 400 years of treating relationships as temporary, communities as transient, belonging as something that would inevitably end in exposure or loss. He'd come to Millbrook 15 years ago, planning to stay 20, maybe 25 years maximum, before awkward questions about his age forced him to move on. But now, after the survivors group, after partnership with Jennifer, after building real connections, the thought of leaving was unbearable. Connor pulled out his leather journal, the one he'd kept for decades. He paged through entries from different cities, different identities, different lives. Cork, 1847. Had to leave. Questions were being asked about my healing abilities during the famine. Said goodbye to Mary without explaining why. She'll think I abandoned her. Better that than the alternative. London, 1666. Plague is ending. I've saved hundreds, but people are noticing I don't sicken, don't die, don't age normally. Time to move on. Will miss my work at the hospital. Pennsylvania, 1781. The war is over. Too many soldiers saw things that raised questions, wounds that should have killed me, recovery times that seemed impossible. Leaving before those questions become accusations. Berlin, 1938. Can't stay. Too dangerous. I've been here too long. And in times of suspicion, anyone different becomes a target. Better to run now than wait for the questions I can't answer. Entry after entry, city after city, identity after identity. Decades of running from connection because staying meant exposure, and exposure meant danger. Witch trials, inquisitions, mob violence, medical experimentation, or simply becoming a curiosity dissected by those who feared what they didn't understand. But Connor was tired of running. For the first time in centuries, he was willing to risk exposure for the sake of connection. He began a new entry, dated today. Millbrook, April 2025. I'm staying. However long I can make it work, I'm staying. The survivors need their monthly dinners, need to know that someone else understands what they've been through. Jennifer needs a partner. This town needs a doctor who can do what I do, even if they never know what that actually is. I'll be careful. I'll manage appearances, claim good genes, attribute slow aging to healthy living, maybe stage minor injuries to seem more vulnerable. I'll probably have to leave eventually, but not yet. Not while there's still connection worth protecting. All these centuries taught me to value survival over connection. Maybe it's time to learn the opposite. Connor closed the journal and made practical plans. If he was staying long-term, he needed to prepare, establish a relative, perhaps a nephew who could be groomed to take over the practice if needed. Eventually, Connor would retire, and this nephew, actually Connor in a different identity, would seamlessly replace him. Document his medical knowledge in ways that could benefit future doctors, even if he couldn't claim credit under his current name. Create deeper roots, buy property, invest in the community, become irreplaceable enough that people overlooked unusual details. Prepare exit strategies anyway, because 400 years of survival had taught him that caution meant always having backup plans. But mostly just live, be present, attend Jennifer's future children's birthdays, watch Eleanor age gracefully into her retirement, support Thomas through continued therapy, celebrate David's restaurant expansion, eventually mourn the survivors as they died naturally. That was the price of attachment, and Connor was finally willing to pay it. Monday morning, Connor arrived at the office to find Jennifer already there, organising patient files with characteristic efficiency. She looked up as he entered. I've been thinking, Connor said without preamble. I'm staying in Millbrook, long-term, as long as I can manage it. Jennifer set down the files. Really? I thought you'd eventually move on. Isn't that what you do? She left the question vague. They'd never discussed exactly why Connor might need to leave, but Jennifer was observant enough to sense there were things about him that didn't quite add up. I've moved around a lot in my career, Connor acknowledged carefully, but I want to stay here. I want to be here for your children, for the survivors' milestone birthdays, for this community. Whatever that costs. Jennifer smiled. So you're choosing to stay put for once? I'm choosing connection, Connor corrected. Jennifer walked over and hugged him. Brief, professional, but genuine. I'm glad. Marcus and I were actually talking about asking you to be godfather to our future kids. Good to know you'll actually be around for that. Godfather? Connor was surprised. I'm not exactly religious. Neither is Marcus, Jennifer said. But you brought me back from death. That feels pretty God-adjacent. We figure you're qualified. Connor laughed, this warm sound of belonging that he hadn't felt in decades. I'd be honoured. They opened the office for the day's patients. Normal medical practice, sore throats, blood pressure checks, routine physicals, prescription refills. Connor found joy in the mundane. Every ordinary patient was a gift, every routine diagnosis a reminder that not everything required necromancy. Mrs. Peterson came in for her diabetes check, complaining that her blood sugar wasn't cooperating. Connor adjusted her insulin regimen and reminded her about diet. Mr. Alvarez needed his arthritis medication refilled and spent 15 minutes complaining about the weather's effect on his joints. Young Katie Johnson had an ear infection, crying miserably while her mother tried to comfort her. Connor treated them all with 400 years of expertise and genuine care. This was why he practiced medicine, not for access to the dying, not just for cover, but for connection to the living. Each patient was a thread in the community fabric, and Connor was finally allowing himself to be woven in rather than hovering at the edges, ready to cut himself free at the first sign of danger. At lunch, Connor and Jennifer ate sandwiches from Millie's Diner and discussed the future. Not Connor's uncertain long-term plans, but the practice's immediate, practical future. We should hire another doctor, Jennifer said. The patient load is getting unsustainable, and if you're planning to stay long-term, you need to not work yourself to death, so to speak. Connor smiled at the irony. Agreed. Someone young, fresh out of residency, eager to do rural medicine. I can train them, give them the experience they need. And eventually, Jennifer added, that person could take over the practice when you retire in 20 years. They discussed expanding office hours, implementing Jennifer's database system, bringing the practice into the 21st century while maintaining its personal touch. Planning for a future Connor had never allowed himself to plan for before. We're building something sustainable, Jennifer observed. Something that could last beyond you, or at least beyond your current identity. That's the goal, Connor agreed. Even immortals need succession plans. As afternoon patients arrived, Connor felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not just survival, not just existing through another century, but genuine hope for a future worth staying for. He'd spent centuries running from witch hunters, inquisitions, suspicion, and loss. He was ready to stop running and start living. Really living with all the risk and vulnerability that entailed. That evening, Connor drove past his usual landmarks, Eleanor's Victorian house on Elm Street, Rachel's home with its newly painted shutters, David's restaurant already bustling with dinner customers, the bridge where Jennifer had died, and come back. Each location told a story of connection, of choosing to intervene, of caring enough to resurrect. He returned to his farmhouse and sat on the porch, watching the sun set over Vermont hills. Somewhere in town, the survivors were living their second lives, cooking dinner, helping kids with homework, planning futures they'd nearly lost. Jennifer was probably discussing baby names with Marcus. Chief Rodriguez was filing reports, and Ian Martin was trapped in a psychiatric facility, imprisoned by a truth no one would ever believe. Connor thought about Ian sometimes, tried not to, but couldn't entirely avoid it. There was guilt there, however much he rationalized it away. He'd played games with a serial killer because he was bored, because centuries of existence had worn away his sense of proportion, because resurrection had become so mundane that he'd needed to add stakes and drama to feel anything. 7 people had died because Connor was bored. 7 people had been resurrected because Connor could. 1 person had gone insane because the truth was impossible, and Connor had let him glimpse it anyway. Those 7 people were alive now. They were living full lives, second chances that they wouldn't have had if Connor had been more ethical, more cautious, more aligned with the normal rules of mortality and interference. Was it worth it? Connor didn't know. Maybe there was no answer. Maybe 400 years of existence meant living with complicated moral calculus that had no clear resolution. What Connor did know was that he wasn't bored anymore. He wasn't detached. He wasn't running. He was present, connected, purposeful. And for someone who'd spent so long avoiding exactly that, it felt like resurrection of a different kind. Not bringing back the dead, but bringing himself back to life. Connor smiled at the sunset, at the Vermont landscape, painting itself in golds and oranges, at the farmhouse that was finally, truly home. This is worth staying for, he thought. All of it. The joy, the pain, the inevitable loss, the impossible connections, the moral complexity, the risk of exposure, the vulnerability of caring. This is worth staying for. After 400 years of existence, Connor McMasters had finally learned to live. And that, perhaps, was the greatest resurrection of all.